What happens when a woman who has spent years investigating sexual violence starts questioning whether the justice system is actually protecting victims? And what if the person answering that question isn't a lawyer, a judge, or another FBI agent, but a masked killer who has decided to punish powerful men herself? Hulu's Furious Episode 1 introduces a disturbing cat-and-mouse thriller centered on FBI agent Alice, a former Brooklyn homicide detective whose career was destroyed after she accused her abusive boyfriend, Marshall, of domestic violence. But Alice isn't simply trying to rebuild her career. She's trying to rebuild herself. And the first case she's assigned to may force her to confront everything she spent years trying to bury. The episode begins with a chilling murder. It's Halloween night. Children are moving through the streets collecting candy while, somewhere nearby, a completely different kind of trick-or-treating is taking place. A young woman wearing a cat mask enters the home of a helpless man. The contrast is disturbing. Outside, Halloween is supposed to be playful. Inside, this woman is preparing to kill. She administers a lethal injection to the incapacitated man, calmly carrying out the murder before returning to the normal world and even fetching candy for neighborhood children. The killer doesn't look like a traditional psychopath. That's what makes the scene so unsettling. She looks young, almost innocent. But beneath the mask is someone who appears to have carefully planned the murder. And the victim isn't random. He's the son of a billionaire. That detail immediately tells us this case could become much bigger than a single homicide. Soon afterward, we meet Alice. She's a rookie FBI agent, but she wasn't always one. Before joining the bureau, Alice worked as a homicide detective in Brooklyn. Her career came crashing down after her relationship with Marshall became abusive. Marshall is also a police officer, and his position gives him enormous power over Alice's professional life. Once allegations of domestic violence emerge, Alice becomes a problem for the department. Instead of being treated simply as a victim, she's treated as someone whose credibility is questionable. She becomes isolated. Her reputation suffers. And eventually, she leaves the NYPD. The FBI gives her a second chance. But it's hardly the fresh start she hoped for. She's initially stuck doing desk work. Then Halloween changes everything. Alice is pulled into the investigation of the murdered billionaire's son. The person behind that decision is Dan, an NYPD detective who is still willing to work with Alice despite everything that happened to her. Their relationship is complicated. There's clearly history between them, but the episode deliberately avoids giving us a simple explanation. Almost every relationship in Furious seems to contain some kind of unresolved tension. Alice and Dan are no different. As they begin investigating the murder, they discover something strange. The victim wasn't simply a wealthy man who happened to be killed on Halloween. There are similarities between his murder and another unsolved homicide from approximately a year earlier. 2 victims, 2 suspicious deaths, and potentially 1 killer. That discovery gives Alice something she hasn't had in a long time. A theory. Alice begins connecting the victims to something much darker. She suspects both men may have been involved in a child sex trafficking operation. And if she's right, the killer may not be targeting innocent people at all. The victims could have been predators, and the person hunting them could be one of their former victims. That possibility changes the entire investigation. Suddenly, the question isn't simply, who killed these men? It's, what happened to the people these men hurt? And that's where Furious becomes much more complicated than a standard crime thriller. The show isn't presenting revenge as an easy form of justice. Instead, it asks whether revenge can become understandable without becoming morally acceptable. Alice knows what it's like to be failed by institutions. She reported abuse. She lost her career. Her abuser remained powerful. So when she begins investigating a woman who may have taken justice into her own hands, the case inevitably becomes personal. Alice is hunting someone who may have experienced the same kind of institutional failure she did. That makes the investigation emotionally dangerous. Because what happens if Alice understands the killer? What happens if she even sympathizes with her? The episode introduces another important character in Nora, an experienced FBI agent who specializes in horrific sex crimes. Nora has spent years dealing with the darkest aspects of human behavior, and that experience has changed her. One of the episode's most revealing scenes happens when Nora notices bruises on Alice's face. She asks who caused them. Alice admits that she met a man online and specifically asked him to hit her. The confession sounds shocking, but Nora doesn't react with the judgment we might expect. Instead, she makes a joke about having experienced something similar. They laugh together. It's an uncomfortable moment, but it's incredibly important. The show is establishing that these women have developed unusual coping mechanisms because of the violence surrounding their professional and personal lives. They don't process trauma in neat, inspirational ways. Sometimes they joke. Sometimes they seek control through strange forms of pain. Sometimes they make decisions that outsiders won't understand. And that complexity is central to Furious. The series isn't interested in creating perfect victims. Alice isn't perfect. Nora isn't perfect. And the killer certainly isn't. The episode's masked murderer represents the extreme end of the same question Alice is beginning to confront. What happens when someone loses faith in the system completely? What happens when a victim decides that waiting for justice is no longer an option? The killer's method is particularly disturbing because she appears to be targeting men connected to sexual exploitation. If Alice's theory is correct, these aren't random acts of violence. They're punishments. The killer may believe she's eliminating people who escaped accountability. And that's where the title Furious becomes meaningful. This isn't simply anger. It's accumulated rage. Rage created by years of being ignored. Rage created by institutions protecting powerful people. Rage created when victims are expected to move on while their abusers continue living normally. But the show refuses to tell us that rage automatically makes someone right. That's the uncomfortable part. A person can have a legitimate reason to be angry and still commit an unforgivable act. The killer may have been victimized. She may have suffered horribly, but she's still killing people. And Alice is an FBI agent. Eventually, their paths are going to collide. The episode's biggest twist is therefore not simply the identity of the murderer. It's the possibility that Alice and the killer are connected by the same fundamental wound. Both women have experienced systems that failed to protect them. The difference is what they decided to do afterward. Alice joined the FBI. The killer became a vigilante. At least, that's how it appears so far. and that distinction could become increasingly difficult to maintain. The ending leaves us with the investigation moving toward a much larger conspiracy. Alice's theory about the trafficking ring suddenly gives the Halloween murder a completely different meaning. The billionaire's son may have believed his wealth made him untouchable, but somebody found a way to reach him. The earlier murder may have been the first warning. Now there's a second body. And if Alice is right, there could be many more victims connected to the same network. That means the killer isn't necessarily finished. In fact, she may only be getting started. And this is where episode 1's biggest question comes into focus. Is Alice trying to catch a murderer, or uncovering the story of a victim who became a killer because nobody else would stop the people hurting her? That's what makes the episode so compelling. The investigation isn't just about evidence. It's about perspective. From Alice's point of view, murder is still murder. But from the killer's perspective, perhaps every victim represents someone the justice system failed to punish. And from the audience's perspective, the show deliberately puts us in an uncomfortable position. We understand the anger. We understand the desire for revenge. But understanding isn't the same thing as approval. That's the line Furious appears determined to explore. And Alice's personal history makes her the perfect person to investigate it. She's already been forced out of one police department because of her own experience with abuse. Now she's entering a case involving women who may have suffered even more horrific abuse. The closer she gets to the killer, the harder it may become for her to separate professional responsibility from personal experience. And if she discovers that the killer was genuinely a victim of the trafficking operation, Alice may be forced to answer a question she has spent years avoiding. What does justice actually mean when the system fails you? Episode 1 doesn't give us an easy answer. Instead, it establishes a dangerous game. A masked woman is killing men connected to a possible trafficking network. Alice is following the evidence. Dan is helping her despite their complicated history. Nora understands the darker side of trauma better than almost anyone. And somewhere in the middle is a killer who may believe she's not committing murders at all. She may believe she's delivering justice. That makes the next stage of the investigation incredibly dangerous. Because if Alice catches her, she may finally discover who is behind the mask. But she may also discover something much harder to accept. The person she's hunting might not be the monster everyone expects. She might be another victim. And that could be the biggest twist of all.